Topics and tea. Topics and tea. Topics and tea. Topics and tea. Welcome to Topics and Tea.
Welcome to Topics and Tea. Thank you all so very much for joining us on today. Um, we are going to get started with our housing edition, Topics and Tea housing edition. We do have our candidate in the house. Candidate Alyia Gaskins is here joining us this morning. So again, welcome. This is the fourth of 17 topic sessions. We are here again with a familiar face to some circles, but maybe new to others who've joined us today, Miss Alyia Gaskins, who is running for one of 6 seats on City Council. You can learn more about Miss Alyia at www.Alyia for Alexandria, 4 is spelled out, and I'll put that in the chat for all of you. We also have 2 special community co-hosts for this session. So you won't be just hearing my voice as in previous sessions and the candidate's voice. You'll be hearing from 2 experts in the field of housing, I should say, for the work they've been doing, not only around in Alexandria, but their work expands outside of that. Miss Michelle Crocker, who is Executive Director of the Northern Virginia Affordable Housing Alliance, and Miss Danian Johnson. Is it Deneen or Danian? Deneen, I keep doing that. You got to keep correcting me, my dear. Ms. Deneen Johnson, who is the housing director within the Central Food Program Alive in Alexandria. So for all of our guests here today, for the purpose of these sessions, it's for the public to start their morning with their favorite beverage. Hopefully you all have it. Whether it's tea or coffee or water, unwind and begin our day being heard as well as being informed. These sessions are meant to be informal. We have questions that residents throughout Alexandria have submitted in advance, and we'll also dialogue with those who had time to join us today. And for our guests, we don't expect the candidate to answer all questions, rather engage in an exchange of concerns and ideas. Key questions and themes from these dialogues will be posted on YouTube, will be summarized in the campaign's social media and blog. So before our 2 co-hosts take it away, I'm just going to set the stage. Miss Alyia, I want to set the atmosphere with you and our guests, and I want to start with an icebreaker for you and our callers. So when I say the word housing, what are your immediate thoughts?
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Jennifer, as always, for hosting this and putting together this forum. I love getting to hear people's questions and to have this, to get my start to the day with each of you. So I'm really excited for this discussion. In terms of the word that comes to mind for me, when you say housing, the first word that pops into my head is health. And it does so for 2 reasons. I think for most folks who know my story know that my mom has asthma, diabetes, and a number of other health complications. And when we were younger, we would go back and forth to the emergency room, sometimes 10, 12 times a year. And as I got older and started asking questions and just observing more about what was happening in our home, a lot of the reasons why my mom's asthma was so difficult to control is because we were dealing with mold and rodents and other issues with inside our home. And so for me, health was directly connected to the place that we lived. And I think we see that now more and more, with the pandemic. The pandemic has shown a light on just how many people are living in housing conditions where they're facing overcrowding or other issues that also exacerbate their health conditions. And so that's what comes to mind for me. Jennifer, I think you're on mute. Oh.
There you go. Thanks, Alyia. That's wonderful. I also want to hear now from, so we heard health is correlated to housing, or housing is correlated to health for our candidate. What about some of our stakeholders in the community, our community members? You can come off mute or you can put it in the chat. We want to hear from you as well. What comes to mind when you hear the word housing? Let's, we'll go, Miss Kelly.
So I guess 2 for me, one is affordability and the other is actually flooding, because that's something we've struggled with in our house.
Thank you. Mr. Burns?
Good morning. I think of shelter, and then I think of, particularly given COVID and its impacts, and then I think of everyone's right to housing.
Wow, right as well. Miss Fran? There you go. You can unmute.
So I actually think of house, the structure, and the neighborhood around the house, because they're intertwined, in my opinion.
Absolutely. Thank you, Miss Fran. I see a Krista.
Hi, good morning.
Morning.
I guess I think of affordability. I worked in child welfare for the city for 30 years. And so affordability and just basic human right to health and welfare and safety and community. Those are the words I think of.
Wonderful. Thank you. Let me make sure I don't miss anyone. Let's see. Oh, and I'll go before our co-hosts. Both of them will take a stab at it as well. When I think of housing, affordability does come to mind for me. But the words of protection and safety, and I think that ties into what was it, Miss Fran, maybe, that you said neighborhood? So, but for me, safety as well ties in. So hopefully I didn't miss anyone, but if I did, you can definitely drop it in the chat as well. And then I'm gonna turn it over to our two co-hosts, Michelle and Deneen, and you two can also answer this question and continue helping us go through the session.
I'll go first. I think of stability. Having safe, secure housing is a real stability and a platform for individuals and families to reach their potential.
I think I would echo that because of the work that we've been doing with evictions. Stability is the first thing that really comes to mind for me as I look at the families that we've been helping, and how much housing is unstable for them right now, and they just are unsure of what the next steps are going to be because of the fact that they don't know how to pay for the housing that they have.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm going to turn this over at this point to Miss Michelle.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm excited to be here and part of this discussion with Alyia. So my first question is around home ownership. And over the last 5 years, the number of Alexandria housing units valued at over 1 million has gone from 2,870 to 5,127, a 78% increase. The number of units under 500,000 has gone from 21,549 to 18,167, a 15% decrease. During that period, the city has added only 303 ownership housing opportunities. What are some strategies the city might pursue to increase the opportunities for affordable home ownership? And I would just add to this, as we all know, this is not only an affordability issue, it is a racial equity issue as well. So Alyia, if you would like to start with your thoughts and get us started on this conversation.
Yeah. Well, my first thought, and Jennifer, you put this in the chat, is just how shocking and disheartening those numbers are. And I think too often when we talk about affordability in the city, we don't talk as much as we should about home ownership. And I think it's critical that we are finding ways to support low income and moderate income home income households and becoming homeowners, but also making sure that for existing homeowners, especially our seniors, that we're finding ways for them to stay in their home. I think all of us know the benefits that come from homeownership, from wealth creation, which is why it's such a critical racial equity issue. And I think at the pace we're going, it's becoming a situation where far too many people are just foregoing it as an option altogether because they don't feel like it's ever going to be a possibility. In terms of some of the things that come to mind for me on what we can do, I guess I would think about it in two buckets. The first being on what are the things we do to help homeownership become more of an option for people. I know the city does have some resources that we provide for down payment assistance and closing cost assistance, but I'd really want to figure out what are the ways that we can increase that amount, and also make sure that maybe there's a dedicated source to being able to pay for that so that more people have that assistance in getting their first home. I think there's also the question of building more homes or increasing the supply. So I'd want to explore maybe models like community land trust. I've seen that work in other cities. I don't know maybe how that might work economically here, but ways that we can ensure kind of long-term affordability and make sure housing is an option for more people. I think the other piece of it around keeping people in their home, I think some of the strategies we could explore or even enhance, given that some exist in the city, would be around housing education and counseling, would be around expanding tax relief. I know we have some programs for our seniors, but I've heard from some estate lawyers and others in our community that a lot of seniors either don't know about it and aren't taking advantage of it, or for the ones who do, there's still additional relief that's needed. And so figuring out how we might expand and improve those programs. And then also I'd want to have resources dedicated to help people with home repairs and modifications, because we know sometimes that those big repairs, whether it's a roof or a leak or something you're addressing. I know somebody on the call mentioned flooding, and there's a lot of things that our neighbors are having to do to just get through these horrible rains, and many folks can't afford that. And then they go spiraling into debt and then are at risk of losing their home. And so how can we make some of those modifications more affordable and easier? But those are some of the things that come to mind for me. I'd be curious what other ideas folks have.
Anyone from the community want to chime in on some things that they've thought about, or even in an ideal world, if you want to think about it as, is this even possible?
Yeah, so I'll add it, and unfortunately, I apologize. I have to leave at 9 for another meeting, but I like what Alyia has said, and I especially like the idea of long-term affordability, which I think is often overlooked. I like the emerging ideas where I think you've seen some increase in ideas where home sharing has taken place. Groups like Silver Nest and Nesterly, particularly aimed at those who have space in their home and might be willing to share that to some degree. So creative approaches like that, maybe in partnership with groups like Michelle's or with the city to some degree. And I agree with Alyia on the need for the homeownership education, and thinking, could we think about that more broadly around just credit building generally for both renters and getting people ready for homeownership. But I like everything she's put out and proposed.
Yeah, this may be something, Rob, I'm glad you mentioned around kind of credit building and sharing. And this may be a model that we could experiment with, especially with some of our folks living in public housing. But I've seen models come up across the country where folks are looking at, when you're a renter, what are the things that you can be doing as a renter in order to start building some equity that you could put into a down payment later. And so being able to maybe have a portion of your rent go into a certain fund or something that each month you're kind of building up money that can be used later, so that public housing becomes a step to the next phase in your life or the next opportunity for housing. And I wonder what some of those models might look like here.
Yeah, I do think like the down payment is really key, because oftentimes your mortgage payment is no more expensive than the rent that you might be paying, especially in a place like Alexandria. And you often get more space when you're paying a mortgage rather than renting, which is easier for families. So finding a way to get folks help with that down payment, I think, is really key. And I also really like the idea you brought up for seniors, because I do think that it's the big projects, but also the little ones, like the little repairs that somebody who's younger might be able to do themselves with maintenance and keep those problems under control. Someone who's starting to have mobility issues or maybe isn't so secure on a ladder, it's going to have to hire out, which is just much more expensive. And so finding ways to help programs, maybe apprenticeship programs for handymans, where they could get more affordable support, especially for folks who maybe don't have a grandchild to come over and ask for help, I think would make a big difference. Because then if they do have to sell, their value is still protected in the home, as opposed to being forced to sell, you know, at a low value for the land that they've been and the home that they've been caring for.
That's a great idea.
If I could just say one thing, I do think we have to tackle the issue of housing supply. It's not only finding the resources for down payment and closing, but if the average price is around 600,000 or 700,000, there's just not enough money or income to address that. So how can we develop more affordable housing opportunities that match the needs and the preferences of today and future generations, young families, singles, people who just want smaller ownership units. So that's another thing we have to figure out in a city that is land constrained, like Alexandria.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Deneen.
I think this is a good segue into our next question. Through the Alexandria Eviction Prevention Partnership, we've been doing a lot of outreach within the community, and the things that are coming up are community, of course, but then also affordable housing as a big issue. And I think there are other communities out there that have been thinking of unconventional ways to respond to affordable housing, like looking at tiny houses, using shipping crates to be transformed into homes, turning homeless encampments into mini villages. And so just trying to think outside of the box, really, when it comes to affordable housing. As a candidate, Alyia, I would want to know, what are your thoughts about the use of these unconventional strategies within Alexandria to address homelessness and the affordable housing issue that we have here?
Mm-hmm. So when I first hear, tiny homes and shipping crates, I guess the first thing that comes to mind for me is they will still need land. We still will need to find a place to put them. And that land is often, I think Michelle mentioned this in her remarks, that we are, a city that's not getting any bigger. And so where's the land going to come from in order to make some of these solutions work? And that if we know we also have other proven solutions around multifamily housing, or if we're looking to do more home ownership opportunities, then how do we really address kind of the land challenge? And so I guess I would say that I would be open to creative solutions like this, as long as they are high quality and as long as they're not perpetuating stigma or segregation by signaling off or grouping one portion of our community to a specific area. Because I would imagine, if we are saying, okay, well, that's the village where our homeless people will live, it's too easy for people to create a negative perception and a stigma aside with, well, I won't go over there, or that's not safe, or those people live there. And so I wouldn't want any solution that perpetuates that. But overall, I think before we can explore those, I really want us to continue to work with the hard questions around, for the land we do have and the opportunities that are available, from some of the parking lots on the West End to other areas where we're looking at new development. How are we thinking about that land and how we grow? How are we, negotiating with developers to get the community benefits we all want to see around affordability, but also around what we want in the neighborhood, how we want those buildings to be designed. And then once we address that, then what can we do to take it to scale so that we're serving a lot more people?
I would open this up to our community members to see what you guys think in regards to maybe unconventional ways to respond to affordable housing, or to just respond to the thoughts that Alyia had. Anyone?
If I may, I'm a community member today.
Yes,
Wearing
Jennifer.
different hats.
if I may, I just want to throw out a thought. Oftentimes even when I walk around the waterfront, I often wonder why we continuously build up and we just don't build homes for people. Even, you talked about, Alyia, housing equals health for you. And sometimes when I think of health, I'm thinking of the views, I'm thinking of just your surrounding area. And that's a whole nother thing, to make sure that every area is a model of beauty for everyone, no matter where you live. Right. But I just wonder, I'm thinking about the waterfront and how we continuously build expensive places, townhomes and sky rises, but why couldn't we just have put some nice homes affordable for low income as well as for families who are paying $2,000 something in rent right now? That low to middle income range for me is just so, I feel like Alexandria does not cater to that population. And so many of us, I'm gonna say myself included, are looking outside of Alexandria after we've invested so much time here. And it's just really disheartening. So sorry, continue. I just needed to say that.
So
I
Jennifer,
want to build off of that. Go ahead.
I was going to say, the reason is land is expensive. Developers are not going to build in that level of housing. I mean, I think all of us those of us who live in single family neighborhoods, and I am not wealthy, I'll put that out there right now. If I hadn't bought my house when I did, I would not be able to afford to buy a house in Alexandria. I wouldn't. So, but developers don't build that because there's no money in it for them. And I think one of the things many would like to see is, how can we make incentives for developers to build those types of homes when they're building other homes, as opposed to, we're going to put up a 4-story building and we are going to have 380 units in the building. And of those 380 units, we're going to give you 12 units of affordable housing. Oh, by the way, we're displacing 24 affordable units now for 12. So, and that aggravates everyone who listens to that and cares about the issues. I mean, that's really the crux of the problem. And I know I've seen, and I can never remember where, when I'm on a forum, the tiny house villages for veterans or teachers. I know I've seen those. I just don't remember what part of the country. But it's, can't we build some kind of single family types of houses or townhomes within that price range? Because there are very few in the city of Alexandria, but that's not how developers work. And that's not what we get. We get the multi-million-dollar Scott, 7 or more story buildings.
Well,
and it's, yeah, I'd love to see more affordable housing built from the ground up that makes sense where they are deciding to build it. Sorry.
I just want to say that I'm really pretty ignorant about how these things work, except, you mentioning the developers. I guess my question is, what do we really value in the city? And there's developers, and then there's political will, and there's citizens. And, how did we get to where we are? And I guess my question is, where's the political backbone to come up to actually implement some of these creative ideas? I'm not convinced it's there. I mean, like I said, I worked in child welfare for 30 years, and I don't see the commitment to low income and middle class folks in the city. And I guess what are your, Alyia, maybe my question is, how would you go about talking to fellow city council people to make these changes? I mean, you can come up with a million creative ideas, but I'm not convinced that we're a progressive city like we say we are. I mean, I'm thinking that those ideas are West Coast ideas, and some are successful and some aren't, but really, we're not as progressive as we say we are, really. I mean, so to me, ideas are great, but where are your negotiation skills? Where are your relationships? How are you going to move some of these ideas forward? I guess would be my question.
Yeah. Well, no, Chris, I appreciate you raising that question. I guess one thing I wanted to touch on, because I think it came up in Fran's response too, is that when we are looking at housing specifically, but also most issues, it is requiring many different players. So I'll get to your question about governing and negotiating, but I think in this particular issue, there's a piece of the political will and what do we want as a city? If we say we want to be an inclusive, diverse, equitable city, all of the things we've been talking about, then we have to be investing in affordable housing, or else that won't be possible because people won't be able to live here and that diversity will go away. I think the piece around the developers and what we get from developers, Alexandria, because of the ways in which we have invested and the amenities we put in, the different things from our parks to our arts, people want to build here and they are going to be building here. We are a hot market city. And so figuring out how we make our vision clear and clear to developers to say, if you are going to build here, then these are the types of things we want to see. This is what we are going to be asking for and need in our projects. I think there's also specific policies we make and set, sort of pushing for affordability levels, pushing for inclusionary zoning, pushing for design. All of those things are things that we have to be setting and holding our developers accountable to. I think there's also another key stakeholder in the community itself, because we know every one of these projects has to go through a community process, and making sure that that process is robust and inclusive and a way that people are feeling they are included and heard and in the decision making about those buildings. And then also the financing piece, because it's going to require developer incentives. It's going to require subsidies. It's going to, especially in an area that costs this much already. And so I think we need people who understand all of those different pieces and are pulling together to try and put together the packages we need for these big complex deals that in the private sector, you may have maybe 2 or 3 different streams of financing coming together, but for an affordable housing project, you may have upwards of 10, 12 different sources of money, all different players, all different people you're trying to coordinate, which makes these projects so complicated. I think your piece about, Krista, about how do you get it done? This is where I feel like my strength comes from. I am a relationship builder and a partnership builder, and in every job that I have had, that has been my role. From working at DC Hunger Solutions, I was leading anti-hunger coalitions across the district, and we helped to pass, I think, 4 different pieces of legislation around the DC Healthy Schools Act to increase school meals for children. When I was at the National League of Cities, I worked with Republican leaders and Democratic leaders and independents from small places of population 850 to New York City, trying to figure out on each of these issues, where's their potential common ground. I think when I look at our council, you need 4 votes to get it done. And I don't think the negotiation should play out just in the council meeting. I'm going to be the type of person who, if I have to show up at your house, knocking on your door, whatever I need to do to be having these conversations so that we're all as informed as we can be, and sort of working with my colleagues to go, the inside strategy. But I'll be honest with you, if I'm not going anywhere, there's also the outside strategy of, at the end of the day, our leaders are supposed to be accountable to the community. And if the community is demanding these things, then I'm going to make sure they know how to get in touch with you too. I'm from calling you to emailing you to showing up with me so that you can hear their stories and understand the implications of what needs to be done. And lastly, I would just say around affordability, I think we are going to have really tough difficult conversations about the types of affordability we need. I was just talking to 3 folks who work for Tenants and Workers, and they were saying, Tenants and Workers United, that every candidate comes to them and talks about affordable housing. But the type of affordable housing that their constituents need and that the clients they serve need is at 40% of AMI and below. And they're worried about the pressures coming in their neighborhoods as Amazon builds and develops. And they look at new affordable housing projects, and that doesn't serve their group. They know it's maybe 60 to 80 or a little higher. And so if we're going to do 40%, that's more subsidy, that's more financing tools, that's other things. And I think we have to figure out then, if that's our priority, let's be clear about it as our priority and figure out how we put the resources there, figure out how we get, other partners to join us in this work, from hospitals to Amazon to other big companies. So I know it's a long-winded answer, but I wanted to try and touch on all the different pieces, but also the partnerships I seek to build on council and with the community to push things forward.
I have a question to kind of follow on that, because for me, density really goes hand in hand with affordability. We're a land constrained city, like we've talked about. If we're really going to have affordable units, some level of increase in density is a part of that conversation. But when we have seen those types of projects come forward, it has been really hard for members of our community sometimes to accept that. And, so whether it's bike lanes and, reduced parking for apartment buildings, there's been a lot of stress. And I feel like a lot of folks feel like their way of life is under assault from this type of vision, which is not something I agree with. I am a biker and love bike lanes, but I wonder how you would approach engaging with those folks who do feel like a 7-story building, because we can get density without affordability, but a 7-story building that we need to build to get those affordable units that we want is a threat. How do we start to engage with those folks?
Yeah. So first I would say you're right. Density, I think, has to be a part of the conversation, which is why when people have said to me, are you for or against density? I'm like, I can't answer that question because it's not that black and white. We have to be able to have density as a tool to be able to use along with other tools to get more affordable housing. I think when it comes to engaging people, again, I'm just trying to think of the easiest way to say this. I'm a person who believes, and this maybe comes from my faith, that at the end of the day, I see the humanity and the potential in you, even if we disagree. And so folks who have been maybe the loudest against some of these projects, I have reached out to them to try and understand, what are the things that they are most upset about? Because for most people, it's not just that it is density. There are some who will never agree. There are some who do not want affordable housing at all. They don't feel that should be in our neighborhood. That's one side. And it is not my job to convince you. And there's nothing I can do about that. But there are other people who genuinely feel, I want to see these projects happen. I just want it to happen maybe in a different way. Or I didn't know it was happening, or I went to the community engagement, but I didn't feel engaged. I was there and I saw a bunch of big presentations, but I didn't actually have a time to dialogue and be a part of the conversation. And so I would want to be finding ways to actively reach out and to be working with our developers, working with our city leaders. We have some great people who are trying to find new ways of doing community engagement, but really figuring out what needs to change in our process so that when people come to a meeting, it is that robust engagement that is not just presentations, but it is we are shaping together. So by the time a project comes before council, people can say, even if I disagree, I feel heard, or they can see where pieces of their, concerns were addressed, that there was a transparent process that's reported back to them about what things were included, what things were not included, and most importantly, why. But I think if we could get our arms around a better process, I think we would be able to have a different type of dialogue in the city and conversation about how these things, how these big projects play out. Because the reality is it doesn't work I would argue it doesn't work for anybody. It's hard for the affordable housing developers who, when you're trying to move a project and it's being weighed down by meeting after meeting or hearing after hearing, that costs money. That delays a project and it makes the next project more expensive. It's not working for the community members who feel like, you know, they're not being heard or they're not getting their voice a part of it. It's not working for the people who we most want to serve, who are then, you know, having to share their life stories and come on display and then feel attacked or feel every piece of their life pulled apart on public display, all because they're just trying to get the housing that we all want and need. So I really want to be working on transforming and finding ways to change that process. And I think COVID has opened up opportunities that we never thought before. We don't have to have public meetings in the same way. There are, you know, new hybrid ways we can do it. There are community conversations. There are different ways that we can experiment and test with. But I want to open that up. I know, Michelle, you've been thinking a lot about this particular issue around engagement and how the process and how it's been going. I know, Fran, you have some ideas as well, so I want to open it up.
I just want to accuse Kelly of stealing my next question, which was around the use of density and other tools. But I think Alyia brings up a really good point. As I am someone who works with affordable housing developers, both nonprofit and for-profit. And the process is torturous at best with all of the funding sources and the time that it takes. So I think Alyia's point about transforming and changing the community engagement process, both to hear from those folks that we don't normally hear from, but also to help the rest of the community understand the development process. I think too often developers are vilified as being greedy or not caring. And in many cases, that is certainly not the case. The costs of land, the cost of development and regulation, state restrictions that are imposed around property rights and land use all play into this. And most citizens, understandably, don't know this level of, don't have this depth of understanding on the development process. So I couldn't agree more with Alyia about revamping and strengthening both the education and community engagement around this issue. I think that will go a long way to helping us all understand what our real options are and how we can come to better consensus. So I didn't mean to get on a platform, but thank you for letting me share that, because I think it's so important in the work that we all do around developing more affordability in the city. And I think Kelly or Fran, did someone else want to say something? And then I think after we go to this, I think Dee has the next question that we'll work on.
I'll just say I was involved in the recent heritage issue. It was ugly. No one does not want affordable housing, but there's a lot of bait and switch. There's a lot of miscommunication. There's a lot of lack of communication. And you know, we do have historic districts here in the city, and we do need to be mindful of the neighborhoods, and not all neighborhoods are the same and not all neighborhoods want the same thing. So, and a good part is the lack of dialogue and the ramming things down people's throats that they don't want, and because they started out saying one thing and, oh, it's completely different than what we started with. So it's a big problem.
I guess I would just say something on the dialogue piece. I heard this the other day when I was talking to a resident, but they were saying it feels like we're only in dialogue when there's a really big project. And what would it, and I guess what's been going through my head is, what would it look like for us as a city to be in a constant dialogue about what we want and how we get there, so that it's not project by project, or it's not the next fire to the next fire, but it is like we are all on the same page about what we want and how we want to grow, and the values we've articulated, so that when new projects come up, we're already thinking about how that fits in. We're able to say to the developers or to say to the other players at the table, like, this is how this needs to work. These are the benefits we need to achieve in order for it to come up to that vision. And I mean, I think the other benefit of that is too, if you are somebody, I think like my mom or others who are working 2 and 3 jobs, you can't go to the long meetings. You can't go sit at the public hearing and be 90th on a list, because that's just not going to happen. And if we're in a constant dialogue, or we're in ways where I can send you a 1 question in a text message versus a 50-page survey and get a pulse check or get other ways, I think there are opportunities to use technology and innovation to create that constant dialogue, that I think would be helpful, and that we need to figure out what that looks like for our city to put some of those things into play. And I truly believe it's possible. I was just watching, there was a documentary, and it was looking at New York City. It was talking about Mayor de Blasio passed a piece of legislation that they were going to significantly upzone pretty much every borough in the city. And there was no community engagement at first, and a number of people came out against it. And it wasn't just, the folks who we label as NIMBY or frustrated, but it was a lot of low income people who were really worried that this means gentrification and displacement. And so their planning department came together, and they started creating these series of like interactive workshops happening on chess tables in parks, happening in bodegas or little stores, little like corner stores in New York, where it was literally like Legos and pieces of paper and people kind of designing and shaping what this needed to look like. And they're doing that with millions of people, and we have far less. And so trying to see where some of those innovations can be applied here, so people really feel not just at the table for the process, but like hands-on a part of it. But sorry, Dee, I know we have another question.
No, thank you, Alyia. I think you bring up a valuable point. But to our next question, I think as COVID has, brought a number of issues, looking at evictions and just the rental situation here in Alexandria, an issue that we've seen are these informal rental situations in which there's a friend or a family member or just a kind person who recognizes that there's this person that needs a place to live. And so what they've done is gone and rented a place on this person or these individuals' behalf. So for instance, I rent a place for Jill and Jane. And I'm not the one living there. It's Jill and Jane that are living there. However, now due to COVID, both Jill and Jane have lost their jobs. They can't pay the rent any longer. However, now I'm being evicted. But it's really Jill and Jane who now have nowhere to live, because I don't live in the area. I've just done something out of the kindness of my heart of trying to find them a place to live, because I have the credit to sustain the rental application. But now we have these 2 people who are going to be displaced, and they have no way to pay the rent. How then what are some initial thoughts on how we can help these individuals or families that don't have the credit to actually rent, are entering into these informal agreements to actually have a place to live? How can we respond and help and assist these people?
Wow. Sorry, I'm pausing just because it really does. The story you illustrated to me just speaks to not just, an affordability issue that we've been talking about, but just how resourceful and how many different ways people are trying to find to get around a broken system just to be able to keep a roof over their head. And we've got to do something about that. I don't know that I know a specific answer for how we how we address those families and the specific things we do. But what I will say is, I wonder if there are lessons we can learn from other systems. And so I have been on the steering committee for Hunger Free Alexandria for a number of years. And one issue that has come up is, for families who are facing food insecurity, there are certain pantries where they'll go to because they're in need of food, and they're maybe in a situation where they are doubled up, in a situation where maybe there's multiple families sharing a 2-bedroom apartment because it's the only way to make ends meet. But they'll go to a pantry, and the pantry, in order to comply and keep their nonprofit status, they need to know proof of address. They need to know that you live in Alexandria. But you might be the person who A, is not on the lease, and so you may not even have those documents. Or maybe there's another situation where you have those documents, but you don't want to run the risk of, flashing anything with your address, because you don't want to run the risk of maybe putting the family at a chance that they'll be evicted, or somebody's going to show up at the home and see the living situation. And so it became this kind of, it just became the situation where, how do you deal with this? How do you get people the food and the resource they need immediately? But then how are you addressing these other issues? And so I wonder if it's in talking with some of our providers that have been stuck in that situation and seeing how they've been able to serve and help families, if they might have some ideas for what we can do to specifically serve families in that situation and get them housed immediately. I think COVID has shown us some interesting examples of, hotel conversions and using spaces that are underutilized to at least get people in housing right away. And I wonder if, when an eviction process like that comes up, where it's a person who is just trying to navigate and they have nowhere to go, are there some situations like that where we can at least get a roof over their head immediately and get them housed first, until we can figure out some of the issues around, because it takes longer time to build credit, it takes longer time to build the other resources to get a long-term solution. But can we at least, do something immediately, and then be working to wrap around that family or that household to provide them with the other things they need. But yeah, I'm all ears for any ideas folks might have on that one.
Any community members that want to respond to that or have any thoughts around that?
I found this, it shouldn't have been mind-blowing, but of course, because we know that this happens regardless. And so, but how you laid it out, Dee, is just makes you think like, oh man, it feels like a secure situation that just becomes insecure. But I'm wondering, is there anything, and I am not the expert, but if there's anything on the front end when someone is being kind enough to make sure that someone is housed, if the person can be like the second name, or however, like on that particular lease. I don't know if I wonder if there's any legal options on the front end to prevent all of these, like this domino effect in the worst case scenario, like we have COVID. Like, so they can still go to that pantry, or they can still receive supports in the face of eviction, because their name is also on it. So resources are directed directly to them. I don't know. I don't even know if that that question makes too much sense, but just wondering if there's anything we could do on that front end.
Yeah, I know this is a really tough situation to come up with, because you want to provide the assistance, but it's this subset of individuals and families that just falls in this kind of black hole of assistance that we just hadn't really thought about. And so it's trying to find creative ways in which to help them. And I think, the response that we've had is trying to get them to reach out to the person if they have contact. In some cases, there is no contact because it was just a kind person trying to help them, where it was maybe a church member who they knew and came across and understood their situation, that they didn't have housing and just wanted to help in the moment, and just, stepped away. And now they don't have contact with that person. In other situations, we have found that they do still have contact with the individual. And so it's really just what do you do now? Can they be in communication to try to help and assist again? So it's a hard one.
Yeah. Dee, I think you had another question that I think ties into this before we close out. I'm looking at the time before we can close out with maybe Michelle, but I think one of your questions around information or resources your last question there may be good to transition here if you don't mind.
Sure. I just further understanding the vulnerable populations that we have here in Alexandria. The question is, how do we develop greater resources for individuals who are undocumented, especially as it relates to housing?
Yeah. Great questions. So I have been thinking a lot about this. It's could come up in other issues, not just housing. And one person who I guess this really gave me a great lesson on it. His name's John Cano, and he does a lot of community organizing in Fairfax County. But used to do some work in Alexandria, and what he spoke to, or what he shared with me, is really, at the end of the day, we have to think about where people get information from and who they trust to provide that information. And so there's a lot of things that our city puts out and does, but that's also information coming from, the government. And if you are undocumented and you are dealing with in a situation where your security is at risk every day, and you're just trying to navigate and stay under the radar, you're going to be suspicious of any communication, no matter how many times it's translated, no matter how many times it's coming, that is maybe an official, document from the city. And so for me, I wonder, for groups that are working directly with members of our undocumented community, whether that's faith-based leaders or informal networks, are there ways that we can really rely on them to help not translate, but to help, connect people to resources, or to bring resources to where people are and have it being delivered in their community by people they trust. I think as part of us doing that, then we need to be clear on how we compensate people for that. I think there's a lot of times where we want to partner with nonprofits or other groups because they are, the anchor in our community, but we're not providing resources to them to actually be able to do this, and knowing that they're already doing a ton of things, and this is one more ask. And so I think the city can be a helpful partner in providing resources for them to go out, to go into community, do it in ways that are maybe incognito or specific to the type of fears and concerns that folks in that community are dealing with and facing, but letting the trusted partner be the deliverer of information, I think, is key.
Does anyone else have any thoughts about that? If not, I'm gonna toss it over to Michelle.
Okay,
I'll just say that I think public-private partnerships are the strongest alliance that you could. I think that's your best chance for success. And I think I agree with Alyia that we could do better in that area. And I think it's the way to go. I think that the government has a lot to offer and a lot of resources and a lot of knowledge, but the people that live in the community and the nonprofits and the networks and neighborhood health and all these wonderful organizations alive, God, was a blessing when I worked for the city. You've got to have those partnerships, but I think that's where the strength is. So thank you for that comment. I agree.
Okay, if there are no more questions, I'll go to our last question. Alyia, Black and Brown residents who have extremely low or low income wages in the city struggle to afford housing here. And they often live in overcrowded conditions because they cannot afford the rent. COVID-19 really showed us how these residents were disproportionately impacted by the virus. So I think you referenced it in your opening comments, but do talk about the connection between housing and health, housing that is stable and safe, and what that plays in the role of mitigating the virus and opening our economy back up.
Yeah. I mean, I think if anything, COVID has shown for folks who maybe didn't know or are new to this field in this space, the deep intersections between housing and health. I mean, our greatest public health advice throughout this pandemic has been shelter in place, stay at home. And I think thinking about this in a couple different ways. The first thing is, in order to be able to do that, you have to have a home. And so it's shown, all of the inequities for people who don't have stable housing and what that means to make sure that we're getting people home so that they can be as safe as possible. I think the other thing it's shown is around the conditions in the home, whether that's overcrowding, whether that's mold, rodents, pests, leaks, if there's flooding and then you have now water in your home, sort of all of the things that then if you are sheltering in place because you're trying to do what's safe for one aspect, safe for preventing you from catching the virus, you may also be in another situation that's exacerbating other health conditions, from asthma to other respiratory conditions or even mental health implications as well. And so when it comes to how we think about, not just in terms of this virus, I do think there's a messaging and a piece that we need to be thinking of moving forward, that housing is medicine. Housing is part of the foundation upon which people build their lives. And we need to make sure that it is affordable. We need to make sure that it's stable. We need to make sure that it's quality and that it's health promoting. I know earlier somebody had mentioned the piece around neighborhoods. And I think that's the other piece that needs to come into housing, because it's both the structure, but also what is around you that impacts your health as well. And as we're able to go outside and, be around, do you have parks and open space? Do you have reliable transportation to get to and from work? Do you have job opportunities so that you're able to build the wealth that's needed to be able to get into a different housing situation? And so all of those things, I hope if there's anything I could bring into play, what I really hope to bring is kind of how do we coordinate across these systems? Because housing is connected to wealth building, housing's connected to food access, housing's connected to transportation. And I think as we plan and grow and really try and wrap our arms around families and children and individuals of this community, their lives aren't that siloed. And so figuring out how we step into what they're dealing with and where we can support and be addressing each of these issues in a more coordinated fashion is critical. And then lastly, I was going to say, I think I saw a message somebody had mentioned around, other partners like Habitat for Humanity. And it just came to mind because, Michelle, you mentioned around some of the racial inequities in our housing that has built upon decades of, predatory lending, redlining, all sorts of policies from homelessness to home ownership that have restrained access for Black and Brown communities. And at the national level, I've been having some conversations with Habitat. And what's interesting is they are now sort of, I think most people are familiar with their model of kind of coming in, building a home and wrapping people and services in that home. They are now doing work with some of their affiliates around like community wealth building and home ownership models specifically for Black families. They are also launching a new initiative to help their affiliates understand the impacts of redlining and how that has determined what communities look like and also where their homes have gone over the years, so that they can start thinking about areas where they put their homes in that have been previously inaccessible or segregated. They are also doing a significant kind of racial equity training with their affiliates and their partners. And so I think all of that is important as we think about the comprehensiveness of these issues.
Thank you so much, Candidate Gaskins, for all of those points. I think I agree with Michelle. It's everything has been, everyone's comments, including the candidates, has just allowed us to really engage with this topic of housing. It's been very thoughtful. So we appreciate your time. We appreciate everybody's time this morning. Thank you so much to our fabulous two co-hosts, Ms. Michelle and Ms. Dee. We did drop in their websites for their organizations. We specifically did Alive, Northern Virginia Affordable Housing Alliance, as well as Alexandria Eviction Prevention Resources. So definitely definitely spread the word. Most of you, if you're here this morning, I truly believe that you're also a community advocate. So spread the word, make sure that your neighbors know about these resources and know about these amazing individuals and their platforms, as well as what they're doing with their organizations. And Alyia's website, the candidate's website, was also dropped in there, and you can email me if you want more information, or even if you have more questions that you would like me to carry on forward to the candidate. So Miss Alyia, thank you again so much. And we will conclude this session. And don't forget, April 1st is on transportation. Thank you all very much. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate
Thank
you being here
you.
this morning.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.